introductions to Moby, not necessary, I don't think. I think we can just dive straight in, can't we?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so.
Oh, by the way, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. As you might, so I have a concert starting at 9:30 right here. And if anyone's coming to that, it's kind of a strange concert because the first half of it is very quiet and acoustic, and the second half is a rave. So if you've brought ecstasy, you might want to wait and take it after the acoustic part. Thanks.
All right. That'll be the most interesting part of the whole thing. No. So yeah, Moby and I were chatting a little bit yesterday and figuring out what to talk about tonight. And you know, I love Moby's music, but I'm no music expert, and he said that was okay. But we thought we'd actually start off on a completely different topic. We'd start off on architecture. I don't know if you've been following it, but Moby has a really cool blog all about LA architecture. So the first thing I was going to do is ask you to talk about it a little bit and why you got started doing it and what it's all about.
Okay, so I was born in New York on 148th Street, and then when I was quite young, I moved to Darien, Connecticut. Is anyone here familiar with Darien, Connecticut? So Darien is famous for a few things. One, per capita, I think it's created more oddball public figures than any other town in the United States. So it has a population of 15,000 people, but people who've come from Darien are, well, me and Gus Van Sant, Robert Downey Jr., Ann Coulter, Steve-O from Jackass.
This is getting scarier by the minute.
Rick Moody, Chloe Sevigny, Kate Bosworth, Topher Grace. So like, there's something really odd either in the public school system or the water. But Darien is also famous because it's where the Stepford Wives was originally based, and it's also where the movie Gentleman's Agreement was set with Montgomery Clift. It's one of the few movies about anti-Semitism. And Darien doesn't fare too well in the movie. So, but I find as I get older, my answers to questions get longer and longer, like Grandpa Simpson. And so I grew up poor white trash in Darien. My mom and I were on food stamps and welfare, and Darien's a very affluent place. So when I was growing up, I became very hyper aware of the spaces in which people lived. Because we lived in a garage apartment, and my friends lived in these palatial estates. And had I lived in a palatial estate among palatial estates, I might not have noticed architecture as much. But I noticed that where I lived was very, very different from where anyone else lived. And then, I guess in college, I was a philosophy major, but I toyed with the idea of being an architect, and I realized simply I just wasn't smart enough. Like I could fake being a philosophy major. You can't fake being an architect, because then buildings fall down. So, and then I moved to LA about 2 years ago, and one of the things that I really love about LA is how there's no cohesion to it whatsoever. It's just a big mess. It's not even a city. I mean, it's one of the most challenging things about LA is trying to figure out how it is a city when it's not. You know, it's sort of like calling a dog a swimming pool and then trying to figure out like, well, the dog is not a swimming pool, but you've called it a swimming pool, so I guess I have to figure out ways in which this dog resembles a swimming pool, which is LA is a big, strange suburban megalopolis that's not a city that people call a city, and it's comprised and filled with the most random, arbitrary architecture in the world, and that's my long-winded answer about how I started my blog, is documenting the architectural weirdness of Los Angeles.
I'd really encourage you to go check it out because the photography is great, and we'll talk a little bit more about photography later, but the little commentaries about these spaces and these buildings are absolutely fabulous. And one of the ideas that you keep bringing up through the posts is this idea of hidden in plain sight. What's that mean?
Well, so I spent most of my life living in Manhattan. And in Manhattan, very little is hidden, you know, because the real estate in Manhattan is so expensive that like you can't have hidden little areas of New York City. Also, I'd lived there for such a long time that everything had become familiar. And I don't mean this to malign Manhattan, but things are also predictable. You know, like if you're walking down a street with nice brownstones, it's safe to say the next block will also have nice brownstones. Whereas when you're walking down a street in Los Angeles, you're standing in front of a pristine example of mid-century architecture, and next door is the ugliest example of public housing you've ever seen, and next door to that is a quasi-mansion that's fallen into disrepair that's modeled on a Norman castle. And it's that unpredictability that I mean by hidden in plain sight. And also, like, you can be driving down Sunset, which is ugly, you know, it's grim, LA at its worst, and literally 50 feet away, you can have beautiful, just wonderful examples of like craftsman architecture or mid-century architecture. So it's the fact that from 1 inch to a next, nothing about LA is predictable.
Does that idea play out in your music at all? Do you take that idea and apply it to music?
That's an example of a really good question for which I don't have a good answer.
So we'll hold
Every
on
now
that
and then,
one.
sometimes people will ask me really smart questions, and I'll just feel like I want to have an equally smart answer, but I just can't think of one.
Maybe we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
The other word you use a lot in the blog, which I also like, is grimy. You describe a lot of LA buildings as being grimy in a really rather positive way. I mean, this is not a negative thing for you, and it seems like every other city that I know of is trying to wipe that out. I mean, you know, New York's polishing all the edges, London's polishing all the edges and taking the griminess away. But what happens to a city when you take the griminess away? What gets lost?
Well, grime for me, like, it's a balance, because too much grime and you end up with Mogadishu. The complete absence of grime and you end up with Singapore. So it's that healthy balance between hygiene and griminess. And when a city is too hygienic, usually that means it's priced beyond the reach of artists, musicians, writers, sculptors, etc. And when a city's too grimy, it's like Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, where the life expectancy on average is about 20 years old. So New York, as it's become cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, there's just less space for artists. The artists have been priced out, and I think LA, the griminess in LA, even though it can be off-putting, it also represents an urban environment that enables artists to actually pay the rent. And I find that as artists are getting priced out of San Francisco, New York, London, a lot of them are coming to Los Angeles because they can still afford big studios and produce big work.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think that, I mean, we've got used to this maybe this idea that the perfect city is the perfectly clean city, but we ought to be finding ways to describe these cities, which is the right balance of, you know, griminess, if you will, that allows creativity still to happen. Because I don't know if any of you have been, Richard Florida's here this week, he's talks a lot about this idea that the heart of the kind of economic well-being of cities is their creativity.
Yeah.
And so we're cleaning it all out and sending it all away.
And honestly, that is one of the reasons why I left New York. Because I'd lived in the Lower East Side for 20 some odd years. And again, it's that sometimes the griminess wears on you. You know, sometimes it's just urban squalor and it's depressing. But one of the things I love, not to keep like glorifying Los Angeles, but the urban squalor in LA is unpredictable because you can go down a street and look at really banal examples of urban architecture and find them uninspiring. But behind the doors of this uninspiring architecture are some of the most creative people on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, you have some great examples on the blog of buildings where you look terrible from the outside or completely boring from the outside, and yet they've got these wonderful interiors and great views, and it must be wonderful places to live.
Well, there's one picture, example, it's my ex-girlfriend's house, and from the outside, it looks like a crack den or a crystal meth lab. It's got like a big black metal door, and the blinds are pulled down, so if you went by it, you would think it was just depressing, typical LA architecture, but then you walk in, and she has these panoramic walls of glass looking out over Griffith Park and all of downtown, and it's that what you see is absolutely not what you get, that I find really inspiring.
Maybe there's also something more human in a way about it. I mean, you can think of griminess as being mess, or you can think of it as being evidence of human activity. Mm-hmm. That, you know, a lot of the stuff on the street is stuff that people are doing, so maybe cities are more human when they've got more of that around.
And another, I kind of want to stop talking about LA because it sounds like I'm just this like.
We will move on.
As I've been brought here by the LA Commerce Board, but is the fact that the egalitarianism of Los Angeles, like we were talking yesterday about Milan and Fez, and you know, really dynamic, remarkable cities with great architecture, but a lot of the architecture, like whether in Milan or Prague or Paris, like these are buildings that were put up 500, 600, 700, 800 years ago, whereas LA, anyone can still put up a building. A friend of mine bought a plot of land in Eagle Rock for $10,000 and built a house for $250,000. So she owns the land and she owns her house. And I was trying to think of any other like big city in the Western world where a graphic designer can buy land and build a house.
I don't think you could do that in Aspen.
You can't, no.
So
Aspen's great, by the way.
It's beautiful. We love it. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. So slightly staying on with the topic of architecture, but bringing in the photography thing, I was wondering what happens when you study a city through the lens of a camera, which is what you're doing, and you know, you take a lot of photography when you travel, but does it change the way you perceive a place when you take images of it?
Yes, and it changes. And he instilled in me this idea that I shouldn't take pictures of what other people have already documented. So like living, like Manhattan, for example. Manhattan is beautiful, but everybody has taken pictures of Manhattan. You know, and it's really not that hard to make Manhattan look good. Mm-hmm. You know, there's the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building or the Brooklyn Bridge or the Manhattan Bridge, and like with a BlackBerry and a crappy low-resolution phone, you can still take...
An Instagram, of course, makes a perfect picture.
So what I try to do, I mean, I feel like a dilettante saying this, but as an architectural photographer, I try and see beyond conventional beauty, and try and at times not to see the beauty and ugliness, but to see beauty that might be surprising, and it might only reveal itself upon a little examination. You know, like if we're in Milan, the Duomo, it's beautiful. Everybody knows it's beautiful, and everyone's standing there taking pictures of it because it's beautiful. But you go down a side street, and you might find a dumpy little house that actually is sort of emblematic or representative of a more human beauty, you know, and a more challenging, less conventional beauty. So that's kind of, on a very subjective level, what I'm looking for.
Well, so one of the things I notice that you often do when you take these pictures is you sort of make up a slightly speculative story about what the building might be. Sometimes you know and you tell the real story, but sometimes you make up a little speculative story about what you think the building might be about. Is that part of the process for you? I mean, does it help you, or just it's fun, right?
Yeah, because I have no idea. Like there's, in the middle of Hollywood, the grimiest part of Hollywood, there's this beautiful Art Deco building, and there's nothing on the outside indicating what it's used for. So I, of course, posited that it's where space aliens live. And because that clearly, where else would they live?
Well, and they've got to be in LA somewhere.
Yeah, and they're not going to put up a plaque saying, "Oh, we're space aliens. We live here." So, yeah. So it's not so much conjecture. It's more just assumptions based on evidence.
Exactly. So, if you had become an architect, or no, actually, no, that's not so interesting. If you were advising, architects and town planners how to go about creating new cities, there are people, the countries all over the world busy putting up new cities, whether it's in China or in the Middle East and in South America. People are busy building these new cities for all these people to live in, all these 9 billion people. How would you advise architects and designers and planners to go about making cities?
A few rules. If I were like an urban dictator, number one, no stadiums. Stadiums kill cities. Like the last time I was in Detroit, I was walking around Detroit, and there's this huge stadium for whatever the Detroit sports squadrons are, and right in the middle, and it's like all the white people drive in and all the white people drive out, and everything around it is like businesses designed for the white suburban people that sort of like pull down their shutters when the white suburbanites aren't there, and it kills. It's like it's like a carcinoma on a city, and also no big box retail. Big box retail, I think it just decimates. It kills communities. So those would be my two big rules.
That would get us off to a good start, I think.
Yeah. What else? As public transportation, I mean, LA doesn't have public transportation, and it's much the poorer for it. I mean, I have some, but I look at almost every other vibrant city lives and breathes with its public transportation. Like in New York, for example, I take the subway everywhere. Because I love it. Like even from the time I was really little, I like the way the subway smells. I know it's weird.
They all do have a unique smell. Paris Metro smells different to the London Underground, smells different to the New York subway. It's interesting.
And the moment you say that, I know exactly this. Like I know what the London Metro smells like. I know what the DC subway smells like. I couldn't for the life of me describe it, except to maybe sound like a sommelier and be like, well, the DC subway is redolent of like
chocolate and a little bit of red currant. Yeah.
Chocolate, leather, and decaying chestnuts.
Yeah, perfect. I read somewhere that you mentioned that if you were going to build your own house, that it would have lots of cantilevers and bridges, which I love the idea of lots of cantilevers and bridges in a house. It doesn't actually sound much like the kind of grimy, hidden-in-place kind of architecture you love about LA, unless maybe you've got some ideas about how you do cantilevers and bridges that would make it like that.
Well, one of the things, if you were to build like cantilevers, it helps if you have a hillside.
It does.
So like bridges and cantilevers in Iowa wouldn't work too well.
Not a good concept.
LA, the danger in cantilevering or building bridges would be that they would fall down in earthquakes. So ideally you have fairly stable hillsides, or you can just with structural steel and huge concrete pilings. So you could have like a 90-foot deep concrete piling and structural steel. You could build some cool cantilevers.
That sounds like a pretty big project. Are you going to get around to it someday?
Well, the property that I have in LA, it's on a ridge, and so I could theoretically at some point start cantilevering stuff off of
Tunneling underneath it, making some kind of James Bond-like thing?
In theory.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Last bit on architecture, I think, but one of your architectural heroes, also one of my architectural heroes, is Tadao Ando, and I think you talked about having had dinner with him one time and it being a great life experience. And I was wondering what kinds of projects you might like to do with him. Not so much building houses, but spaces for your music, for instance. What would that be like? And
do you guys know who Tadao Ando is?
Should we describe? So, you know more about him than I do. Famous Japanese architect. Beautifully minimalist building, mostly out of cast concrete.
Yeah.
That have a surprisingly human quality to them, considering they are so simple.
Yeah, I mean, like one of his most famous spaces was a UNESCO meditation space, and there was a school of architecture in the late '60s and early '70s called the Brutalists, like Louis Kahn, and they used a lot of brutal materials, and they didn't try and cover up the fact that they were using brutal materials like structural steel and concrete. And so Tadao Ando will use big, giant walls of concrete and somehow make them look elegant and graceful and meditative. So it's not like hard, cold modernism. It's more this like pristine Taoist elegance using concrete and steel and sometimes wood. What I love about a lot of his buildings is they're not residential. Like I don't know that he's actually made too many residences. They're churches or museums, and they're very idiosyncratic and very unconventional, and they all seem very meditative. So I'd love to build, if he built like a huge, vast, elegant concrete space, it'd be nice to just fill it with some sort of sound that made sense in a gigantic, big concrete space.
It's interesting because I suppose we design a concert hall like the LA concert hall. I know that the sound designer for that, who's actually Japanese also, really worked with Gary very closely to kind of construct a sound in a building at the same time. But that's about the only time I can think of that happens. And yet the sound of buildings and in buildings is incredibly important.
Well, you're touching on one of my huge pet peeves. You've had this experience when you go to a restaurant, like a brand new restaurant, and it's been designed by some hot shit architect, and everything's shiny and new, and the moment you walk in, it's deafening. Because every surface is reflective, like they've got mirrors and stone and steel, and like, unless you're out of your mind on cocaine and screaming at the top of your lungs, there's no way you could be heard. Yeah. So I mean, I think that they must be like giant restaurants built by and for coke addicts. Because to try and sit there and have like a quiet, civilized conversation, or hedge fund managers, like people like traders who are just used to screaming. You know, where you're not interested in listening, you're just interested in yelling at the top of your lungs. Yeah, yeah. So that drives me a little bit crazy.
Yeah, in fact, I try and keep my list of restaurants that I can go and have a conversation with somebody versus restaurants I go to just for fun or even just the food. But yeah, so sound and building is really important. Moving on to something that you do a lot of, have done a lot of through your career, is collaborate with other musicians. You've worked with Lou Reed, David Bowie, Bono, Michael Stipe, Chris Christopherson. What makes, how does collaboration work for you? Why do you do it? What causes something to be a good collaboration for you?
Well, it starts with the fact that I never expected to have a career as a musician. I thought that my life would be spent working in a bookstore, teaching community college, and making music in my spare time that no one would be willing to listen to.
20 million albums later.
Yeah. It's all accidental. Okay. And so collaborating, it's simply, when I was growing up, you know, a lot of the musicians you just mentioned were my heroes. David Bowie, Brian Eno, and simply if one of my heroes comes to me and says, do you want to work on something, I just say yes. Like, I don't ask for details. I don't expect to get paid anything. I just love working with my heroes.
Do you ever reach out to them and suggest a project?
I could, but I
haven't. I think you're probably well known enough by now to do that if you wanted to. Just a thought.
That's a good idea. But as a result, I've got so many just anecdotes that I wouldn't have believed when I was 12 years old. Like, one of my favorites was I was going on tour with David Bowie, and we were also doing a show at Carnegie Hall together. And he came over to my living room one morning, and we were sitting in my living room, and I had an acoustic guitar, and we played Heroes. So it was like sitting in my living room, just the two of us, me playing acoustic guitar and him singing Heroes, drinking tea, sun's coming through the windows.
That's pretty special.
It was good, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you're, I mean, how does it work? Are you building new tracks with these folks? And if so, how do you work with them? And is it kind of a equal share thing, or do you wait for them to bring something to you and then you work with it? Or?
It's all random. Like, I keep collaborating with David Lynch. It's the same thing. I love David Lynch, and if he came to me and said, and I'm going to impersonate his voice because he's got a distinctive voice. He said, Moby, we're making a movie down in Patagonia. That's in Chile. We need someone to come and clean the toilets. Would you be willing to do it? I would say, yeah, of course. I'll fly tomorrow and meet you in Patagonia and clean the toilets on your film set. But so he and I have done so many weird things. Like, I've done remixes for him. He's done, by the way, to my credit, that was a really good impersonation of David Lynch. So like, we've done remixes for each other. We've played music together. I learned how to meditate in his studio. I was the DJ at his wedding. So it's basically just this availability to any type of collaboration. Like, if I respect the artist, the musician, the whomever, I'm just open to do whatever. You know, even if it's just sitting in a living room playing guitar, drawing pictures, whatever.
So is that the way that you make all your music, in the sense that you're sort of sensing the world, or your music is a response to things going on around you? So if you're making a track on your own, is it completely different from when you're working with a other musician, or does it turn out to be sort of the same?
I don't know.
Okay.
Because the way I work,
probably a dumb music question.
no, it's a really good question. But it's like the way I work on music is I go into my studio and I start playing music and I see what happens, and I never think about it. Like it's always sort of a monastic, automatic process. But I maybe 0.001% of the time do I have an idea beforehand. Like, do I think, oh, I'd really like to make this type of song? As it normally just go in and just sort of pick up a guitar or a keyboard or whatever and just start playing around until something interesting, at least to me, results.
So is that even the case when, like, I remember you did a James Bond theme track some years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, at least you had some sense of that was going to be a Bond track, presumably, when you walked in the studio.
I did a cover of the James Bond theme, and I felt like such a fraud because the original is so good. I was like, why? It's like, why am I covering this iconic, amazing piece of music? Like, there's no way I can improve on it. Like, I'm just going to do sort of like a contemporary bastardized version of this classic, iconic piece of music. So when I released it, I was a little embarrassed.
I kind of liked it, though.
No, I'm not saying it's bad. I just think the original is so much better than what I did.
So, science fiction. I think we're both kind of science fiction fans. And I know
Should we ask if any other science fiction fans?
Oh, there's one or
A
two.
few.
Good. So we're not going to be completely geeks up on the stage here. But and I know in my world, in the world of design, science fiction affects design hugely. I mean, things have been invented in science fiction that we've then spent decades as designers trying to make. Like that, you know, right now a lot of people are working on the tricorder. You know, this magical medical scanner that they invented on Star Trek 40 years ago. And actually, there are a couple of companies getting close to it.
It's not just medical; it detects oxygen, atmosphere.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. But actually, it turns out the oxygen thing we've been able to do that for a while. You know, there are lots of other examples and stylistic ones too. You know, I remember when Ridley Scott created Alien, that, you know, alien-like stuff was appearing on every design for years afterwards. Does that happen in music too?
Absolutely.
Or does it happen for you in music?
Well, that's because I grew up watching Space 1999 and Star Trek. I mean, Star Wars is kind of like science fiction for people who don't really like science fiction, except for the second movie. That was good, the one in the clouds. But, sorry, not to malign Star Wars. I know people seem to like it. But yes, I grew up obsessed with science fiction, and when I was really young, I wanted to be a scientist. What that meant was I wanted to work in an environment that looked like the bridge of the Enterprise. Like I wanted to have oscilloscopes and buttons, and somehow, magically, I've become an electronic musician, and I have a studio that looks like the bridge of the Enterprise. But I really think that, like when I first heard electronic music, whether it was Kraftwerk, this is in the mid-'70s, I was like, oh my goodness, this is the musical equivalent of Star Trek. And so I've always loved, I mean, I grew up playing classical music, but I've always loved electronic music because it always, to me, sounds like the future.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's incredibly romantic. So we're going to open up for questions in a second. So get ready if you've got questions. And it's kind of dark, so it'll be hard for us to spot people, but we'll do our best.
Is everybody having a nice time so far?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because the dangerous thing about rambling on, as I'm prone to do, is I have no idea if I'm making any sense.
Don't worry about it. You're making
Really?
lots of sense.
Okay.
Yeah, you're making lots of sense. It's great.
Okay.
It's great. I'm interested in, when we talk about the arts, we often kind of combine together without really thinking about it, performing art and creative art. So, you know, as a designer, I'm mostly a creative artist. I make stuff and put it out into the world. I'm rarely a performing artist. Tonight, I'm sort of a 10% performing artist.
You're doing great.
Oh, thank you. But they're both arts, and they've got some similarities and they've got some differences. You do both. I mean, you're absolutely a prolific creative artist. You're a prolific performing artist. How do they differ from each other? And when we are trying to educate kids to go into the arts, and we're saying one moment go be a ballet dancer or a rock musician, the next moment we're saying go be a painter or an architect, and we're kind of almost making it sound like it's the same thing. But is it the same thing?
I think it's a great question. like for example, as a musician, my job of being a musician in a recording studio has nothing to do with being a musician on tour performing. I mean, like tonight, playing acoustic stuff, it's more improvisational, so there is a creative element, but a lot of times when musicians go on tour, it's fun, but it's not terribly creative. You know, especially if you're playing, I'm not complaining, but if you're playing songs that, let's say, you wrote 20 years ago. You know, like if the Rolling Stones are playing Satisfaction, it might be fun for them. It's not terribly creative, recreating a song that they wrote 45 years ago. So as a result, over time, it's led me to not like touring. You know, I love nights like tonight because we get to talk, and then I get to play acoustic stuff, and then do weird DJ stuff. So there is a creative element. But sometimes when you're on tour, you're standing on stage, you're playing a song that you've played 1,000 times, and you can't experiment with it, or else people in the audience will get irritated.
Yeah, they really don't like you when you mess around with the tracks they love, right?
Yeah, like if you go to see the Rolling Stones and they do a bossa nova version of Satisfaction, or, you know, I don't know, you go to see Radiohead and they decide everything they're going to do is improvisational 12-tone experimental music, you're like, okay, I can see how that's fun for you, but like, when I go to see a band, I want to hear the hits. You know, I go to see Duran Duran, I want to hear Hungry Like the Wolf sounding exactly like the record.
And who wouldn't?
You know, and so I assume that if people come to see me, they wouldn't necessarily want me to play Hungry Like the Wolf, but they would want me to play some of my songs and have them very closely resemble the versions that they're familiar with. So as a result, touring and performing, it's fun but not terribly creative, and that's why I hope to spend the rest of my life touring as little as possible. Because I'd much rather be at home in my studio creating, you know, like making new music, even if no one ever listens to it, just because it's so much more satisfying having something at the end of the day that didn't exist at the beginning of the day.
So, actually, this will be my last question before we hand it over to the audience, but your last album, Destroyed, you published it alongside a book of your photography, which, if anybody's interested in trying to understand what it's like to be on tour, it's one of the best examples I've ever seen. Those images just delightfully show the rhythm between, on the one hand, incredible kind of loneliness. You're on a plane somewhere over some landscape. It could as easily be Central Russia or South America. You often can't even tell. And then these mad crowds that are in front of you as you perform. And it really tells the story that you were just talking about. I mean, that performance is it's a kind of a treadmill, if you will.
And I think it explains why a lot of musicians become alcoholics and drug addicts. It's sort of a way of trying to like balance your neurochemistry, or also to keep the party going. You know, you play your show and there's 50,000 people cheering, and then you leave the stage and you're in a concrete room by yourself with no cell phone reception. And it's I won't complain about touring, because I really do believe that like a public figure musician complaining about being a public figure musician is just absurd. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, boo-hoo-hoo, I have to stand on stage and people pay attention to me. Oh, terrible. It's hard. I suffer. But it's a really weird way to live. Yeah. And it does strange things to your psyche because you can spend months, if not years, if not decades, living in these artificial environments. I did one promotional trip. It was in winter in Europe, and it was about a month long, and I realized in the entire month, I spent 99% of the time breathing recycled air. Like I was only outside, like walking to a car, and I was like, what am I doing? Like, how is this a healthy way to live? To sit in these, go from one artificial environment to another artificial environment to another artificial environment, and to base your quotidian experience on that. So that's another reason why I don't want to tour, because after a while it starts to seem normal. And I think musicians are generally emotionally unstable to begin with. Like being well balanced and sane not necessarily, they aren't the best qualities for someone to have if they want to be a professional musician. But touring year after year definitely erodes whatever last little bit of sanity a musician might have. And it's just a really, because traveling, and I don't want to belabor the point, but you're always in an environment that someone else has manufactured for pure utilitarian expediency. You know, an airport, like, sure, it looks nice, but their goal is to get you in and out as quickly as possible. And a hotel room, their goal is to make it easy to clean. You know, all they want when you're gone is to get rid of any biological evidence that you were there as quickly as possible. Never bring a Lumalight to a hotel room.
Have you tried?
I didn't, but I saw a special on that, and they took a Lumalight to like a Days Inn and a Four Seasons and whatever. They're all covered with semen. That is the dirty secret of hotels, is they're like a crime scene. So as a result, this is just many reasons why I don't want to spend the rest of my life living in strange artificial environments created by people I'll never meet.
But you should definitely go and check out Destroyed. It's a great visual record of that whole experience. So I think it's time to open it up to the audience for questions, and I'm the struggle. I think we have microphones. Please wait for a microphone because we're recording recording this. So all right. So whoever got the microphone first, stand up, say who you are, and go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, Moby, Tim. It's great to be here. I'm Francis.
Hi, Francis.
Stuckins. Hi.
I feel like I'm at an AA meeting.
Well, I'm a science fiction addict, and I'm kind of proud of it. We went through. Here's my question. Because I like the idea of you were linking architecture to music, and asking if that affected your music. I'm talking about science fiction, and there was an era when I was growing up where science fiction was on everybody's mind. Comic books, and then we had the Beatles, and then we had Star Trek, and everything kind of took off from there. Man landed on the moon, and in the future, it'll be a record. What you're doing, it's a record. Say 100 years from now, and this thing about science fiction and rock and roll being connected. Do you think that's a valid point? Do you think that's something you were doing, like when you were working with Brian Eno, David Bowie, possibly Robert Fripp? I don't know. I'm asking you if you ever did. And that's science fiction and rock and roll to me.
Well, I think that I'm just speaking subjectively, the relation between science fiction and music is that they're concerned with the same broad idea, which is either representing a very sort of utopian view of human nature and the world in which we live and the world in which we could potentially live, or a very dark dystopian view. And they're both excited by, like utopia as manifested or represented in science fiction or music can be really compelling, but dystopia can also be really compelling. And so I think that from my perspective, that's in a very broad way how the two are related. Does that make any sense?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, are you looking forward to...
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next.
Because you don't have a microphone.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next question. So I forgot, I think the way we're going to do this is I think we've got microphones that can just about get to this bottom tier here and the next tier up. So if you're further back than that and you want to ask a question, you'll need to come forward if you want to get access to a microphone. So, okay, so who's next? Who wants to ask something?
Any flattering complimentary questions?
Has somebody got a microphone already?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. You want to talk about baldness and virility?
Oh, that's better.
First of all, thank you so much for bringing an eloquent voice to electronic music. It's such a wonderful, brilliant experience to hear you speak about what you do. But we talked a little bit about your collaborations, and unfortunately we omitted some of the female artists you've worked with. I know you have a past with Gwen Stefani, and I'm just wondering, this is a trend that we see with DJs working with female singers. Do you have anything that we can look forward to?
Well, I've collaborated with a lot of a lot of female artists over the year, whether it's Sinead O'Connor, Jill Scott, Gwen Stefani, Heather Nova. And now, I mean, most of my records, the vast majority of singers with whom I work are women, but at this point, most of them are my friends. Because every now and then there can be like a celebrity collaboration that I feel is done for artistic merit, but more often than not, it seems like a lot of collaborations are done for marketing reasons. And so for the last few records I've made, I've tried to really stay away from that and only work with friends of mine or people in my neighborhood, because I feel like it makes the process a lot nicer. You know, when you work with a rock star, and rock stars are awful. They're such a pain in the ass, and you have to go through lawyers and agents and managers and blah, 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 and they have demands. I mean, we're really awful. But if you work with your friends, they come over, you make spaghetti, you hang out, you record some music, you watch Family Guy. Like, the whole process is a lot nicer. And also, I feel like if I'm putting a friend of mine on a record, it benefits them more than if I put some rock star on my record who doesn't necessarily need the extra attention. So as far as future things, I'm working on my next record right now, and most of the guest vocalists are friends of mine. Hopefully, at some point, they'll become huge, ginormous, entitled rock stars, but for now, they're friends of mine who work at Starbucks.
Okay, yep.
Hi, I'm Jim Vishansi. Since you said you're classically trained and you do a lot of collaborations, have you ever thought of doing any collaborations with some of the classical crossover artists? Because you're in Aspen right now, home of the Aspen Music Festival, and you've got a lot of those people here right now.
I would love, I mean, I've done the closing music for all of the Jason Bourne movies, like Bourne Ultimatum, and they just finished editing the next Jason Bourne movie, and I got to record with a 110-piece orchestra. I mean, I've worked with chamber orchestras, much smaller, but standing in the room actually like working with 110 remarkable string players and brass players and woodwinds and percussion, it was amazing. So yes, I mean, it's when I was very young, I grew up with classical music, and so I'd love nothing more than to collaborate with composers, musicians, yeah. So yeah, I'd be thrilled and happy to.
Cool. So do we have somebody? Oh, okay, yeah.
I was hoping that you would talk about the work that you're doing with neurology and music and helping disabled people with language issues and things like that.
Well, so there's an organization called the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function, and it was started by Oliver Sacks. You all know who Oliver Sacks is, like the man who mistook his wife for a hat and Awakenings, Oliver Sacks. And about, I guess, 30 or 40 years ago, he and a woman named Connie Tomeno were doing some experimentation with music therapy. And they realized that music, apart from being fun to listen to and fun to make, actually is a really remarkable therapeutic modality. And when I say remarkable, I actually mean borderline miraculous. So they've worked with aphasic patients, people who've had really debilitating neurological problems, people who've had strokes, and they found people like who've lost the ability to speak can still sing, and people who've lost the ability to walk can still dance. And it almost, I mean, granted, I'm not a neurologist, so I don't really know what too much, I can't get too specific, but it almost reminds me of phrenology. You know, like you have those old like phrenological maps of the human brain where like, this is the criminal part, and this is the part that likes cheese. And so, but there's some truth to that in that there's like a speech center, and when the speech center is damaged, the client loses the ability to speak. But the brain responds comprehensively to music. So when someone's listening to music, their whole brain is involved. And as a result, you can bypass the speech center, which enables people, like I've seen the institutes up in the Bronx, and I've seen remarkable things where like a woman who has lost the ability to speak, hasn't spoken in decades, can sing her favorite song from when she was a child. Like it's just truly miraculous. The NIH, of course, doesn't recognize it because no one makes money off of it. So if there are any people who are good lobbyists, we're really trying to get public funding because it's miraculous work. And I think the website is musichaspower.org or IMNF. And I'm really glad that you asked that question, because they do phenomenal work.
And are you actually producing music for them, or are you working with them as a musician?
I help them raise money. I help them, because another thing they do is they have some recording studios. So they'll take clients into the recording studios and get them to write songs, record songs. They have the most remarkable jam band in the world, average age 85. There's this one woman, she's got to be 95 years old. She's the tambourinist. And she's just so happy. She just sits there shaking her tambourine, completely out of time. But she just couldn't. It's so therapeutic. Like when you look at the joy on her face, and it's phenomenal.
So this just makes the whole idea that music's disappearing out of schools and kids aren't getting access to music in schools even more tragic. And
Yeah, I completely agree. And they've also done quite a lot of work with music and autism and music and Asperger's, and it can also be a remarkable therapeutic healing modality.
do you think is there any hope for in terms of getting music into kids' hands? Is in the sense the tools that you use? I mean, are kids just getting hold of music their own ways today instead of having to study it at school? I mean,
I had lunch with the Bezos scholars, and we talked about that during lunch. And it was one of the questions was, what do I think about the fact that people are making music in very unconventional ways now? And far be it from me to judge. I sort of love the fact that anyone with a computer can legally or illegally download software and 5 minutes later be making really great sounding music. Whether that is a replacement for guitars, violas, drums, pianos, whatever, I have no idea, but I just love the fact that people are making music.
And I guess we don't know, maybe we do, whether getting involved in that kind of computer-based music then encourages kids to start to move towards instruments later on.
And from a neurologic perspective, whether creating sequencer-based music on a laptop has the same sort of therapeutic benefit as sitting down in front of a piano, I would assume that it's similar, because there's just something remarkable and healing and therapeutic about just creating music and being bathed in sound that you've had a hand in making.
Cool. Good story. All right, do we have a next one? Yes.
Right here. Hi, Moby. My name is Mark Goodman. It's a pleasure to listen to you speak so eloquently. Curious to know how you keep it fresh and where you find sources of your inspiration.
Well, it depends who you talk to, because I think there are quite a lot of people who would maintain that I don't keep it very fresh. I think it's by just being as open as possible, not indiscriminate, but just, because I have friends who are in the world of jazz who only like jazz, and friends who are in the world of punk rock who only like punk rock, and I'm like a gadfly. I love everything. Again, not indiscriminately, but it's the idea of allowing myself to be inspired and moved by so many myriad different types of music, regardless of how they're made or where they come from. For example, my first ever music teacher only liked complicated music. So he, unless it involved complicated music theory and really weird scales that no one's ever heard of, like Phrygian scales and et cetera, odd scales that you wouldn't even want to listen to, he only liked very, very complicated music. And I remember telling him that I loved The Clash, and it broke his heart. He was like, there's only 3 chords in that song. And I was like, yeah, but I like it. So I think it's just by allowing myself to like everything, and also not worrying too much about whether something is new or old or fresh or stale, because I think music affects us subjectively and emotionally, and if I start employing too much either semiotic or intellectual or cultural criteria to the music I'm exposed to, it makes it less powerful, because I have nothing against intellectual music, but I really like music that can affect me emotionally. So I guess that's what I try and do.
So I think we're probably down to the time for the last couple of questions. So make them good ones.
I was going to ask, what do you think of the big explosion in EDM for the last couple of years? I know there's a big story in Rolling Stone this week. And
Yeah,
the big
yeah,
tours
Rolling
and
Stone
everything.
always only about 10 years late to the party. Rolling Stone, okay, I'm just going to be petulant for a second. 1999, I put out an album called Play, and thank you. And Rolling Stone in 2009 came to me because they wanted to do a story about 10 years after the making of Play, and I said, sure, but you guys know that you never even reviewed it when it came out. And they were a little sheepish. And they said, yeah, we also only gave Led Zeppelin bad reviews. So, which is true. Rolling Stone never once gave a Led Zeppelin album a good review. God bless them. But so you're asking about EDM, which is one of my favorite acronyms because it's one of the most literal acronyms. It stands for electronic dance music. And in the world of music, normally like terms for music like jazz and funk and like they're sort of like poetic and sexy. Like electronic dance music sounds like a software in Zurich. A software designer in Zurich came up with this. Ja, stimmt, we call this electronic dance music. Why would you call it anything else? So the rise in electronic dance music, if I'm going to be completely honest, a lot of it, it's because of the events themselves, these huge events. There's one of the most successful ones is called the Electric Daisy Carnival. The first year I did it in LA, I think 90,000 people came. But it was an underground event. They didn't have a press tent. They didn't have a publicist. It was all word of mouth. So 90,000 kids came to an arena to dance to electronic dance music. And the next day I was having a barbecue with a lot of my friends in the music business, and not a single one of them had heard of this event. And I was like, this is one of the biggest festivals in the United States. It took place 5 miles from where you live, and you don't know about it. And now they're writing about it in Rolling Stone. The explosion is based on these events, which are phenomenal. Like the production is unlike anything I've ever seen. This huge, overwhelming production. And the fact that, as I said earlier, like anyone with a laptop or a computer can make really great sounding electronic dance music. And this is where I can potentially get into trouble. Even though I'm sober, I have to say honestly, a huge part of it is the drugs. Like if you take ecstasy and stand in the middle of 80,000 people listening to phenomenally produced electronic dance music with the best light show you've ever seen, you're gonna have a really nice time. So I think that is part of what keeps people coming back. Yeah.
That was great. All right, no, we still got a couple of minutes. I don't want to cut us short. We still got time for at least one more question, I think. So,
hi, back here.
Okay, whoever's got the microphone gets to go.
Just have a question for you, Moby. Obviously, lots of people today are downloading music and downloading your music illegally. I'm just curious your take on that now, and also how your impression of that has evolved over your career.
Well, I have to be diplomatic in my answer. So all I'm going to do, like when you watch a DVD or a movie, it says like the opinions expressed in the commentary do not in any way reflect the opinions of Fox or their employees. So what I'm saying is purely my opinion and applies only to my music. And it is, I make music because I like making music and I like the idea of people listening to it. Personally, I don't care how they listen to it. If they pay for it, fine. If they don't pay for it, fine. I'm not concerned with whether someone's listening to it on Pandora, Spotify, some BitTorrent site, or whether they're buying it on iTunes. Purely for me, I'm not concerned. I'm more concerned with the process of making the music and the way in which someone responds to the music emotionally. Having said that, I understand why other musicians are more concerned with this, because maybe they have like a parent who's getting dialysis treatment, or a kid going to private school, or maybe they need to buy a walk-in humidor for their cigar collection. I don't know. But for me, it's not something I worry about. I put music out there and I just hope that people listen to it. I will say that it's been baffling to watch the ham-fisted, clueless ways in which the major labels have tried to get people to pay for music. Like for the RIAA to sue housewives for listening to music is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my, like, I don't want to get in trouble and malign the RIAA. I'm sure they're just following orders from someone, but like, punishing your audience is not a good way to get them to love you. It's not a good way to get them coming back. And what I've also found with people who steal music, like, the truth is I don't steal music because I'm lazy. Like, it's actually much easier to just go to iTunes and hit buy. I would steal music if I knew how to steal music, but I'm not very bright and I'm lazy, so I just go to iTunes and pay for it. But I think a lot of people who do steal music, in the future, buy it. You know, and if they don't, they probably weren't going to buy it anyway. So I don't think the problems in the music business come from people stealing music. I think it comes from record companies treating their artists terribly and treating the audience terribly.
Okay, so this one is the last question, so here we go, make it good.
Okay, thanks for coming, Moby, and really looking forward to the show tonight. A question is about the EDM explosion. Considering house music had its start like 20-odd years ago from Detroit and Chicago, it's been massive around the world. Why do you think it's only just got popular in the US in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, house music for me technically started probably at 1987, 88, with in Chicago with Marshall Jefferson, Frankie Knuckles, Adonis, and you're from Manchester? Yeah. And that, I mean, the UK, oddly enough, it's sort of, house music started in Chicago and immediately went to the UK. And the UK became like the world center for house music. Like all the Chicago DJs and the Detroit DJs would all spend all their time going to the UK, because if they were playing in Detroit, 100 people would show up. And if they're playing in Manchester, 1,000 people showed up, or 5,000 people. The response, I'm trying to think, how can I not, because I could talk about this for a long time, but like a lot of this has to do, like why it's taken a while for dance music to catch on in the States. A lot of it, not to sound like a cliched lefty, but is a result of racism and homophobia. Like in the late 70s, there was a huge disco backlash in the States. So much so that they actually burned disco records in sports stadiums. And a lot of it was that disco music came from the gay community, the Latino community, the African American community, and so it was like thinly veiled racism, kind of like the Tea Party. Although the Tea Party is not thinly veiled. And so I think it's really, and also the music business in the States wanted to sell albums, and traditionally people who made house music made singles, and they were also fairly faceless. You know, the producers, you know, so the record companies wanted good-looking artists who could make albums, and electronic musicians tend to be unattractive people who make singles, present company included. And so I think that's part of it. Another thing is electronic music in the States, like it happened in around 91, 92, and then it disappeared for a little bit. And it came back in 95, 96, 97, then it disappeared. And I don't want to get in trouble, but a lot of it was drugs. Like a lot of my friends who were DJs and promoters in the dance music scene would do so many drugs that they would just be debilitated. So that, you know, drugs are one of the things that helps dance music explode. It's also one of the things that helps dance music implode. So that's my strange, rambling, long-winded answer.
Well, okay, so that was a fabulous conversation. Thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And please give it up for Moby.